Okay, we are live with the guest. There is Scott. Okay, the main reason why I invited the guest Scott here, apart, first of all, he knows more about many things than I do. Second, because there were some questions about on-prem Kubernetes that we are going to go through, and I know nothing about on-prem. I'm a cloud spoiled brat or something like that. Anyways, Scott is here. And we're going to go through questions, both those that you're posting live, so just start typing, and those that you posted in some other threads, comments in before this started. So we're going to mix and match, right? Now, Scott, just you yell when you know the answer, and don't wait for me to say, Scott, what do you think, or something like that. Okay, so let's go through the first. The order is kind of in the same order you were posting things, so no filter or any type of thing. So first one from, I cannot pronounce this name. I don't know what's Amoenus. Anyways, what is your recommendation for enterprise application vertical slice repo organization? I assume that this refers to GitOps, kind of like how you organize. Do you have a preference, Scott? How you organize your manifests?
My answer is I don't like any of the ways to organize GitOps manifests, but in general, I think that folders is the only way to do it, and it has to be a separate GitOps repo. I've seen customers people that try to put manifests alongside with the source code, and that's a pattern for disaster. In my mind, it should be in its own GitOps repo. And the blast radius should be typically per application. So multiple microservices make sense in one repo, but having one, let's say, business application per GitOps repo is typically what I find to work the best.
So manifests and source code of the application do not mix?
No.
Okay, you see the first question, and we already start the fight.
Exactly. You also like Argo CD, and I'm a Flux guy. You know, what can you do?
I know. I think that Flux is better than Argo CD in many ways. I prefer Argo CD because Flux is slowly dying. Kind of. I don't like. I don't even like humans that are on the edge of dying. So kind of my beef with Flux is different. Architecturally, I think it's better actually. But anyway, I prefer that to have manifests in the repo of the application, and then separate repository with Argo CD or Flux manifests that are pointing to the app repo. And the reason why I like that more is because when I work on some project, I want to have source code of the application. I want to have a script that builds it, Docker file, whatever. And among many other things, I want also manifest to be there because I want to run it while I'm in that repo locally.
Right. I get that, and I have no problem with manifests being in that repo, but that should never be the repo that anything is connected to that syncs down to the cluster. Meaning if you're working in GitHub, there should be a GitHub action that literally copies that file to a GitOps repo. And the reason is because the biggest failure that I see is people that try to pull that manifest, then have Argo CD go and clone down their entire source code repo to get the single deployment YAML that they want to apply to the cluster. It crashes GitOps tool, it crashes everything.
Okay, now I want to check what you think about this. I think that pure YAML should be stored in those environment-specific GitOps repos or whatever. So, and I know that this is unpopular. If I'm using Helm, I do Helm template and then push that YAML somewhere, or YTT whatever, or KCL whatever. Doesn't matter what technology, kind of like. I want those pure YAML there, not some Helm template that. And then somebody asked me, what is this? And then I need to do mental calculations of all the conditionals and variables and what's not.
Listen, one of my least favorite tools of all time, but they got one thing really right, was Jenkins X. that were the first ones to do that reverse GitOps, where they went and templated and then pushed back up to a Git repo, the rendered manifest that they got pulled down. There were many other challenges and issues with Jenkins X as Jenkins X.
Really?
The least of which being that Jenkins and Jenkins X had nothing to do with one another. So they just pulled another JavaScript basically on the world with the most confusing name. But that idea was golden. I think the fact that, yes, I give you what my desired state is, did Helm templating, put that to Git, and that is what got synced was a beautiful idea.
Yeah. Okay. No, so we're not fighting that much. Okay, we'll change that soon. Okay, next one. Now, this is a live question happening now in the stream from Marco. What kind of production workload would you never run on Kubernetes? And I guess that the hint is why databases, that the hint is that you should never run databases in Kubernetes.
So I do run databases in Kubernetes. I think it really comes down to, again, it's all the question of what your expertise is. If you're running in the cloud and you do not have very strong DBAs in your organization, then run with RDS where it is more managed, everything is great, and just connect to that from your cluster and don't do that. But if you do have database expertise, run cloud native PG. It's going to be cheaper. It's closer to your application. There's going to be benefits of any way you go. There are always challenges the more you take on to yourself, but you also have more flexibility. So the only types of production workloads I would not run in Kubernetes is I have seen examples of people that try to make monolithic applications or very large applications that can be one pod per node that pass in direct NVMe devices into them because they need pass through of specific accelerated hardware. No. There's no reason to add overhead if you're not going to gain the benefits of Kubernetes. So if you can enjoy Kubernetes, be in Kubernetes. If you can't enjoy the dynamic nature, the freedom, the robustness of Kubernetes, why take that upon yourself?
Yes. I think in a similar direction that I think that so let me put it this way. I think that any workload that runs, I'm excluding SaaS now, Google Cloud Run and stuff like that, the self-managed stuff. Anything that you run outside of Kubernetes can run just as well or better in Kubernetes because it's still running on the same servers and so on. You can say this application runs on this specific server in Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that there are applications that are worse off in Kubernetes, but I do agree that kind of you can ask yourself, but why bother? Kind of like, why bother moving it from here, wherever it is?
Exactly. If it's a monolithic application that you update once a month, that is, some huge thing, or that there's still manual processes to do the updates of things that you have to do at runtime and okay, fine. Don't throw it in a container, have it run the way it is. Hopefully you rewrite that application to be something, more modern, but as it is, well, if you need to exec it to the pod to make changes in order to make it work, don't run it in Kubernetes.
Exactly. Another way I like to define it is kind of, if you have application that you haven't bothered to modernize in a decade, kind of like, what do you think will happen when you put it in Kubernetes? Kind of like, will it be auto-magically better somehow? No.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Now, going back and forth. Now, this is one from before. What are your current must-have CLI tools for developers? And I will make assumption that, because in my head, developer is everybody, right? Ops people are developers. They write some code or they should be fired. But I'm assuming we're talking about, typical Node.js person, right? End user, application developer.
Yeah. For me, I know you're a DevOps guy. I still haven't gotten onto the Nix trail myself. I'm an ASDF fan personally, which is, again, just a multi-version manager. I'm sick of NVM and all the different, tool-specific version managers. So I've just moved to ASDF for everything. And I think that, or DevOps, something that allows you to easily manage multiple versions of any tool that you want is the key. Whichever way you go.
Yeah, I think that there are two parts to that. How do you get all the tools you need to work on a project? That would be whatever you suggested, or Nix, or it could be also content. There are many solutions for that. And the other thing is, how do you perform certain operations, right? Build this, and I'm becoming a huge fan of Nushell.
Really?
Yes.
Can't. I tried.
Oh, I love it, but not. I don't think that a typical Node.js developer should be into Nushell, but it's very convenient way to create very quickly some kind of wrapper. So you don't need to worry about kubectl and YQ and JQ and this or that. I can just wrap it all and give you CLI wrapper. You can do it with Shell as well. I mean, Python doesn't matter.
Yeah. I would say the number one thing also is Gum. Just have Gum locally from who's that from? From the guys from Bubble Tea and all of that, from Charm Stage. It just makes any of your different, whatever shell scripts, all of that, just so much better. Just install Gum and just have it there, and you can make pretty shell scripts that work better and make you hate life a bit less.
Okay, the next one from Disco Trotinet. Oh, I think that's from Balkans somewhere. Hello, is it wrong for Argo CD to reference public Helm charts directly from their repo, or is it better to copy them into a private repository? And I will add to the mix or a registry as OCI image.
I personally believe that you should always be relocating to a local registry, except when you are in development. When you're testing something out, when you're doing all that, don't go through that whole process. But once you have something, always move it over. One of the biggest things that was announced 2 days ago, for example, Bitnami, the number one open source, whatever packager in the world of Helm charts, is now going to be affected by rate limits in Docker Hub, starting in a week. That means that anyone that is depending on that public repository is all of a sudden going to start hitting rate limits when they start pulling things down, and stuff is going to start failing, right? You have no control there. Now, I will say it should be moved over and acted as if it's read-only in your local repository. Meaning you should not be forking and making changes and all of that, because then you move away from upstream. But definitely have it locally. For images, I've always used Harbor personally myself, and we use Harbor as a Docker pull-through cache. So it basically, any request we make to Docker Hub or to GHCR just goes through Harbor, and then it caches any image locally. There are tools for relocating Helm charts as well. Much safer.
Yeah, and many of the Helm charts now are OCI images, so you can just treat it as any other image.
But you can. The one challenge is, and this is where there's a great tool called Chart Syncer that I do recommend people use, because the challenge with Helm charts, and this is why I'm a Carvel person myself and not a Helm chart person, is that you relocate a Helm chart. That's great. All the values files are still pointing at all of the Docker Hub images. There's no way of saying, hey, please relocate this entire Helm chart and anything that it's referencing, right? Because it's Go templating, pre-text. There's no way to easily just relocate that. That's more of an on-prem issue, let's say an air gap, that becomes a real challenge. So Chart Syncer allows you basically to sync a chart. It updates the README, updates value files, and relocates all of the images to your own registry. So that's a recommendation that I would give in that area, because it's not enough to move the Helm chart. You want to move the Helm chart and its dependencies.
Exactly. Okay. Their team. This is now, again, from before. As a small company that wants to publish their code, how would you ensure SCI license checking of dependencies in a pipeline? I have no answer to that, so it's all you, Scott.
By small company, the question is how much are you looking only at open source tooling or not? But there are standards in the industry, standard tooling. I'm more involved in, let's say, some of the enterprise tooling like Sneak that can do this type of stuff. But there are multiple tools that exist out there. It's just a matter of finding the right one. The easiest way is go to the GitHub Actions marketplace and search for SCA and find one that looks good to you, that has the most stars, and I would start from there. Because GitHub Actions becoming the de facto standard for modern development is a very good place to see trends happening in the industry of which actions are being used. And a company that publishes its own GitHub action to the GitHub marketplace, in the end, is a company that I believe probably has a product that's more worth looking at than those that are not investing in, the CI ecosystem of the future.
There we go. He knows. Okay, from Juan. Hello, is it possible to have two fully independent Crossplane installations in the same cluster? I had some issues with cluster roles. Thank you very much. I don't think that you should ever... I'm not even sure whether that's possible because I never tried it. I don't think that you should ever do that.
Nope. You can't, and it's a challenge to all operators because one of the design decisions of Kubernetes, whether we like it or not, is that custom resource definitions are cluster-wide.
Exactly.
So there's just no way to manage this. Even things like I work some on Cluster API, and Cluster API also had this challenge. Initially, there was a case of multi-tenancy where we were able to run multiple Cluster APIs in a cluster with like flags saying only watch these namespaces, right? And it came to issues of how do I upgrade now? Because I need to upgrade the CRDs. I'm going to break one of the controllers automatically when you have a breaking change in your APIs. If you need this, do vCluster. Install vClusters and install Crossplane into the virtual cluster.
Exactly.
And then work that way. Because there's no real challenge of having multiple clusters beyond the waste of resources. vCluster solves that for you, and then you're in a much better place.
And the answer you just gave, that's not specific to Crossplane. Basically, any third-party application it uses CRDs and controllers, don't. And that's basically almost all of third-party applications today. Don't run two Argo CDs, please, or two Fluxes, or two whatever. Two Kyvernos. Please don't. No.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, this is from before. How to implement dynamic ephemeral environments for a microservices application with databases using Argo CD. How can those be toned down automatically when a certain condition is met? I have very radical opinion about this. But I don't know whether I should go first.
Considering that I, by definition, stay away from everything Argo CD because any tool that believes that a config mapper secret for managing a CSV for permissions that was built for Kubernetes, in my mind, is not a legitimate tool. I give that off to you to make your statements.
So I think that this, my answer is equally valid, I feel, for Flux, for Argo CD as for Flux. I see a lot of value in using some form of GitOps for permanent environments because I want to see the desired state, I want to see the actual state, I want them to be always in sync and so on and so forth. I don't buy it for the ephemeral environments. So let's say that my goal would be to create an environment when somebody creates a pull request and then tear it down when the pull request is shut down, right? Or maybe after an hour or whatever. I think that kubectl apply is just what you need. Forget about Argo CD, forget about all those things. Just create vCluster if you can. Shove it there. Helm install or kubectl apply. It just works. You get instant response. You don't need to wait for synchronization. I'm not sure that there is a value in GitOps for ephemeral environments. I think that's my point.
So I would say there's only one benefit here, which is that if we take a look at sometimes applications, a microservice, right? I'm developing a microservice, but that microservice actually to test it, and let's say these would be more what I would call preview environments, right? That, from a PR, that example you were giving. For a preview environment, sometimes, as was mentioned here in the question, you need a database alongside it, or I need these other two microservices. I'm working on the back end and I want to deploy the front end application so that I can test my changes, right? if I anyways need to manage an Argo CD manifest that's saying pull in these 3 Helm charts and this customization and go and apply it because it's from multi-repos or dependencies or whatever, if I need to go and now manage that separately myself
but
in kubectl applies and GitHub Actions, no. So like there is a benefit of taking that shared manifests and doing it, but this goes back to the idea that I mentioned with Jenkins X. If you are templating out to a Git repo plain manifests and then apply it, then we're in a good situation. You can just kubectl apply it.
But on top of that, I also believe that in those so if I have an application and I want to deploy it in some preview environment, whatever it's called, I think that the best thing would be if you have to run it against quite a few other dependencies. I think that the better approach is not to deploy them into those environments, but just connect it. Have something production-like environment where you connect your application against some other application running in production. Sorry, not in production, but production release.
Right.
And here is my radical opinion. If you work on your application and you call it microservice or something like that, and you expect that the release you're working on right now should be working against something that is not production, I think you're making a terrible mistake.
Completely agree. Right. Again, I think that one of the challenges is that there's the ideals of microservices, and then there's also the reality of Kubernetes and where 90% of organizations are, which is it's not real microservices. They are tightly coupled to one another. It's, what we call modulus, right? It's a monolithic application that's just broken up into modules, right? Which is
then
fine.
Then everything goes. But
exactly.
in those situations, to me, in my head, that's one application.
Yeah.
Just you happen to split it into modules, whatever you want, but that's still one application then.
It is.
Okay. Next one. This is now live from Gurav. I'm a bit confused about should I go a little deep in Python or learn Golang as it's used in cloud native space more? Which programming has better future in cloud SRE roles? And Scott is going to say TypeScript because that's what he's into right now.
I'm not into it, but I am into Backstage, so de facto, I guess I am into it. In my mind, the answer is whatever language, find the project you want to work on, find the thing that interests you, and then learn that language and invest in that. Any of these languages, if you learn JavaScript well and know JavaScript well, moving to Go is very easy. If you know Go very well, moving to Python is very easy. Learn a language well, and then moving to other languages in this area is very easy. And these more, let's say, scripting, more native languages, not things like, moving from Java to C++ is a different story than the JavaScript, Python, Perl, if anyone still uses Perl, goes of the world, right? So I would say typically find the project and then learn the language that's relevant to that project.
So basically what you're saying, if I understand right, and if I do, then I agree 100%. Learn how to program, how to write code. Switching languages is, unless it's Rust or Perl, it's easy.
Right. And learn to program on a project that interests you. Don't go down yes, you can start with a simple calculator or snake game like everyone does. But in the end, when you're learning to program on a project that actually interests you and not just following random tutorials. Because if you're interested in it, you will push through the challenges in the learning process and learn a lot better than doing it on some, little game that you built on the side because someone told you to, that you have no interest in and, is going to go nowhere.
Okay, next question. This is from before. This is interesting from some guy called V. Rabbi.
So I'm asking myself the question?
I guess so. What would be a real... Okay, let's do together and see kind of like where do we differ. Ultimate setup of Kubernetes cluster if you could choose end-to-end of all the pieces. From which cloud to which distro, which base OS, which CPU architecture, which system. And there might be more, but then this is the maximum number of characters I can put here. But I guess to answer those questions, we need to kind of go into areas, right? Kind of like, I don't know, observability, right? And
right. I think it was
synchronization.
which system components.
What
Was
do you
like
mean
the
by
final
that?
word here was components. Like, okay, from like the infra level down to which system components would you install into your cluster? From observability, GitOps.
Okay, okay. So which types of components would you?
Exactly.
Okay. All. I don't know. None. I get. I feel like that this is where people make a mistake when they're starting. Is that I want it all, and kind of I'm going to have networking and service mesh and observability, and I'm going to have 57 of them. And when things go wrong, then you don't know where to look at. But I personally I'm willing very often to sacrifice things up to a level for the sake of having some kind of a standard and having my life easier. Like, for example, for observability, and I know that by far it's not the best choice, I like Prometheus simply because I know that all the other projects in Kubernetes cluster that for some reason need observability metrics are going to talk Prometheus for sure and something else maybe. Just as an example, right? And I'm not saying that Prometheus is the best choice, right? Probably Datadogs of the world are better choices than Prometheus, but everything just worked because of the standard, right?
Exactly. No, I completely agree. And that's where I think, like, whenever it looks at any of these things, my approach is like, which cloud really depends on where your other things are running, right? I mean, there are which distro is better. Obviously, take the distro of the vendor. So if you're in Google, run GK. If you're in Azure, run AKS. If you're in AWS, use EKS. I don't see the reasons for the Rosas of the world, like the Red Hat OpenShift on AWS or the, Rancher on AWS or that. Like, there are some edge cases where like it may make sense. Typically, go with the default distro of the cloud provider. Base OS, do you have an opinion on this, Victor, on base OS of container optimized versus like standard Ubuntu, let's say?
So I had before. Now I'm mostly in GKE and AKS and EKS, and I don't care.
So the one reason that I still do care is that on some of these cloud providers, the kernel versions are not always the same. And as we move more and more into the eBPF space, there are more and more issues that some of these tools have with more esoteric operating systems. Everyone tests against Ubuntu. I have yet to meet a tool that cares about the operating system, runtime protection, and eBPF tool that doesn't work on Ubuntu. But I've met many that at some point in time didn't work on Amazon Linux 2, or didn't work on Photon OS, or didn't work on Core OS, or didn't work on this weird distro from another vendor.
Yeah, but that's also going back to what I said before about some kind of standards, or let's not say standard, but what is commonly used. So if you have a project, whichever project, X, right, that is based on eBPF, you can be sure that as long as it's possible, they're going to make it work on default setting of GKE, EKS, AKS. Kind of like, maybe not today. Maybe I'm not saying that there are no projects that are not working, but those are the first three that they are going to invest into, right? Kind of, you're more likely, generally speaking, forget about eBPF. The more you use the out of the box, whatever Google, Azure, AWS gives you, the more likely things are to work.
Yeah. I mean, again, going with standards is a good thing. And I think the standard could either be, if you're multi-cloud, I think there are values of going with like an Ubuntu across the board because that way you have the same thing. If you're single cloud, go with the default of the cloud.
Okay. Next one. This is live now from Sebastian. Can you make a video on how to build OCI images with Melange Apco? I'm ashamed now, Scott. I don't know. Do you know what is Melange and Apco?
I don't.
Okay. So Sebastian,
I guess I have some weekend reading to do.
Yeah. Now you gave me gave me work over the weekend instead of enjoying it. Shame on you, Sebastian. Okay, next one. Adam, what do you guys also live thought on tools like Camel, Coolify, Dogploy, etc.? Do you recommend for small scale deployment that are not resource intensive? And I'm ashamed again. I have no idea what those are.
Neither do I.
Well, folks, today you are very exotic, kind of. And I until today's session, I kind of prize myself that I haven't used all that stuff, but I heard about it at least. I haven't heard about those things. Okay, more homework. Another live, until we find an answer to, and then we'll switch to offline. If you have deployment manifests in the same repo, how do you handle bumping the version of images? Currently, I'm doing it with GitHub Action to separate repository that makes a new commit. GitHub Actions and YQ?
Yeah, and just write back to the repo.
Push back, exactly. Clone the code, repo, YQ this or that.
Exactly. The one complexity with that is that you have to set then your GitHub action to only run based off of changes to specific directories within the repo. That if it was just a source code repo, any change to the repo triggers the CI pipeline, right? Because you don't want the CI pipeline to re-trigger based off of the commit of the image that it does itself and then get into a loop.
Yeah. But, you know, I mean, more often than not, I have GitHub Actions running on application repos, right? Kind of commit changes to the code.
Yeah.
I rarely have even GitHub Actions in those, let's call it GitOps repos or something like that. But yeah, if you don't want to re-trigger something, square brackets skip CI. You GitHub Actions at least.
Exactly.
Okay. One, let me see. Next one. Okay, this from before. Will you ever discuss private clouds and OpenShift? And this is the main reason why Scott is here. That's why I called him in. Because I don't do private clouds, but I think that you do. Is that
I do.
correct?
I do public cloud. I do public cloud and private cloud. So I think Kubernetes in the private cloud or in the, let's say, on-prem data center is definitely a unique beast that definitely is not as simple as it is in the cloud. There are multiple things that need to be done there. I think number one is like there are certain just realizations that the public cloud comes with. Like, yeah, you're going to be able to use Let's Encrypt in many cases for a cert manager, not on premise typically. Typically, you're using local domains. It's not something that's public. Active Directory is a very common certificate service on premise, and it doesn't have a REST API, so there's no official cert manager integration there. There is a side one by DJ Cormo that was originally Nokia, but the number one thing when running on premise is just because when you're in AWS, EKS comes from AWS doesn't matter. What matters is that you have a vendor that is providing you Kubernetes that is managing it in terms of full lifecycle support, full everything, and has packaged it into an easy to consume manner. Do once in your life Kelsey Hightowers, Kubernetes the hard way. Do not install Kubernetes that way. I highly recommend. I don't care what vendor, what tool, whatever. There are better ones in my mind, less good ones from technical perspectives, commercial perspectives. Doesn't matter. Choose your poison of choice. But get a product that is a wrapper around Kubernetes and install that. Do not go down the Wild West. You will suffer.
100%. I think that even Kelsey said that he would never do what he was talking about in Kubernetes the hard way today. Kind of like that. No.
Exactly, right? And try to always keep also with what is the industry doing, right? If you are in Azure today and you create a new cluster, you are 99% chances going to run with Cilium as your CNI. If you are in Google, there is 99% chance you are running with Cilium as your CNI. If you are an EKS, you aren't. If you're running on-premise and you have a choice of what to use an industry standard CNI unless you have a reason not to. Right? So there are reasons for other CNIs, but try to keep up with what the cloud is doing. And if the cloud is doing specific things, you see that both Amazon and Microsoft have added Flux CD as their GitOps tool into their offerings. Maybe that's what you should be using as well, because the industry and all of the tools being built for Kubernetes are being built on those public cloud offerings. So if you follow what they are doing, then you are going to have an easier time bringing in third-party dependencies.
Brilliant. Okay, question from Victor, but you can answer, Scott, as well. I've never heard you mention ECS. Do you avoid discussing it because your focus is always on Kubernetes? So I think that AWS is a bit special. So I think that within public cloud, I think that there are two good choices to run your applications. One is Kubernetes because it's a standard kind of like that's right. Kind of, you know what it is. Everybody adopted it for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think that there is a great value in not using Kubernetes and going for something like managed service for applications like Google Cloud Run is awesome, right? Ignoring the price now. Azure Container Apps, awesome. Now, AWS is special. AWS doesn't have something like that. The closest to those things would be maybe Lambda, but Lambda is special. That simply doesn't work for significant percentage of applications, right? But ECS, I cannot confirm this, but my theory is that AWS thought that they are going to push ECS while others are pushing Kubernetes, and kind of they're going to win that fight, and at the end realize that no. And today there are more Kubernetes clusters in AWS than anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So I'm negative of ECS because I did not see the point of it in the past, and I see even less point of using ECS today.
Yeah, I would say ECS initially, I could see a value in it. It was a simple API. It was simple to use. Yeah. Kubernetes was not mature. The issue is that ECS over time has become as complex as Kubernetes because they've started to add in all the features because people have come in and said, oh, but I need sidecars. Oh, so they added in the ability to add in sidecars. And, oh, I need this capability. So they added that in. And now the JSON file descriptor of an ECS job is as complex, if not more, than a Kubernetes manifest. So why at that point do you go with the vendor lock-in tool? It's better to use EKS. And if you need simplifications above that, install Knative, install tools like that give you simple abstractions on top of Kubernetes, especially with EKS releasing now. I forgot what they called it, EKS Automatic or something like that. That was just released at Reignite. That's, kind of like their opinionated and more managed version. Azure have AKS Automatic. Google have Google Cloud GKE Autopilot, right? Like they all have services that make it easy to manage Kubernetes. So install good abstractions above that. And that's where I think the money is today.
Yeah. And especially because of the ecosystem. One day you will say, I want this, whatever that is. And you will see that something works most likely only in Kubernetes.
Exactly.
Whatever that something is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the next one from before. What do you think about... Okay, I'm very biased. What do you think about AWS announcing CRO, Kube Resource Operator, instead of using contributing to Crossplane? I'm very biased. I don't know whether I should answer. Do you know about CRO?
I do. Listen, I'm excited to see more and more tools in this area revalidating the idea that we should be using Kubernetes to create higher level abstractions and that you shouldn't need to know Go in order to create those high level abstractions. I like that idea. CRO itself, I am less of a fan of how it has implemented it. I think it's almost like Crossplane 1.0, the versions of patch and transforms versus where we've gotten to with functions in Crossplane. That I understand why they did it. I can get it. I like the fact there's another tool in this area and that it's not like, oh, you should be talking about control planes in Kubernetes and give me examples. Crossplane and Crossplane and Crossplane. It's nice that there are other tools. I just think Crossplane is a better design.
Yeah, that's similar to what I think. Kind of, Crow is basically in a similar stage where Crossplane was a while ago, right? Before functions and so on and so forth.
It's a simpler user experience or platform engineer experience, but that comes at the expense of it has 90% less of the capabilities than Crossplane does today with its advanced functionality.
But yeah, what is absolutely awesome about it, what I guess you were hinting at, I think that Crow is amazing for the Crossplane project because it validates the idea. Kind of, it's a validation. I mean, it's not the first. Actually, I could say that Kubevela could be the kind of the initial.
Exactly. Kubevela with the OAM model, and you had Crotix a bit in that area. And right, there are multiple tools trying to do stuff in this area, whether using Crossplane and providing higher abstractions or other tools, but they're all just a bit less generic and flexible than Crossplane is. Yeah.
Okay, the live one from Arc 180. What are your thoughts on microcates? I don't use it. Scott, do you use it? Do you know?
I don't use it. If I need lightweight Kubernetes, it's either Kind or K3S, and see no use personally in any of the other ones.
Yeah, you know, it's. I think that this is one of those things that, like years ago, I would enter into heated debate, and now I think that they're all good enough.
Exactly. They all just give me enough. I go with Kind typically because I have my opinions. If I'm going to test something out, I want to install the ingress controller that I care about, or I want to install the CNI that I care about, or I want to install some of these other ones are more opinionated. You get a more out-of-the-box, nice experience. For those, K3D, amazing experience for local development. Go spin up K3D. You get your ingress controller. You get everything set up for you, and it just works. If you want closer to production, but for local development, Kind with a simple, task file or something like that, or make file if you hate life, bash script, whatever it is, very easy to spin up and, get working.
Okay, from Cube, this one is from before. I would just bootstrap cluster with Terraform. Crossplane for me is more about infra for application to have upper definition, all dependencies in one place. I think that Crossplane did itself almost kind of made a mistake to start and focus initially in early days and bundle somehow providers like AWS, Azure, and stuff like that with Crossplane. To me, Crossplane is first and foremost compositions. Kind of that's the main feature of Crossplane. I don't care. I mean, I could just as well use it without providers. Maybe only with Kubernetes provider. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that the way I see Crossplane compositions is that it is a way to compose and abstract Kubernetes resources, right? And whether those resources happen to be Kubernetes deployment or service mesh or AWS EC2 or Azure something else, what those Kubernetes resources do afterwards, to me, that's a separate story, right? It just composes Kubernetes resources. To me, that's and as such, I don't make a distinction whether it's application or infrastructure. I mean, for many things, I don't even know anymore what is application and what is infra.
Well, I think this question is really about that whole chicken and the egg, right? Which is the challenge with Crossplane. It's the same challenge we had with Cluster API of the chicken and the egg of how do you bring up that cluster that is going to run Crossplane?
Oh, yeah.
Because Crossplane needs to be installed somewhere, right? But how does it manage itself and that?
Yeah. I mean, one way, and I'm skipping now any discussion about commercial, outbound, this or that.
Use the
ignoring
free
that
tier
for a
of
second.
Upbound for this one, which is enough to bring up one cluster. Use the free tier of Upbound to bring up your cluster. It's more than enough to create an EKS cluster, then install open source Crossplane on there and have a nice day if you want to stay in the free world.
Exactly. Or even, you mentioned before kind. What I did quite a few times is spin up kind, Crossplane, install Crossplane, spin up EKS cluster or whatever I'm spinning up, and then move Crossplane to that cluster and say, now you manage yourself. But
Exactly.
it's similar story like with GitOps, right? Kind of, can you do GitOps without first manually installing Argo CD? No. Can you manage Argo CD after you install it with GitOps? Yes.
Exactly. Completely agree. That's, by the way, what we did with Cluster API. With Cluster API, we have that same issue. The standard way is it deploys a kind cluster, installs Cluster API, installs the providers, create your Kubernetes cluster that's your management cluster, install Cluster API onto there, and then run with their CLI cluster cuddle move, which is basically export, import into the cluster, that it starts managing itself and everything is great. Same thing you can do with Crossplane. There's even some guy, I'm forgetting who, Evgeny, I think is his name, who put out actually like a CLI that does this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, next one from Adam. What do you guys recommend for very lightweight container runtime? I will not answer this question because I will assume that this refers to on-prem. Because in cloud, like GKE, I don't even know anymore what GKE uses at runtime.
GKE uses containerd unless you have the confidential computing, and then has gvisor, which you can use as well. But right, in Azure, it's by default containerd, but you can use Kata if you want to enable that node pool and get VM isolation.
What I'm trying to say is that in public cloud, by default, you don't choose. You just whatever they give you, kind of, and you choose if you have special requirements.
Exactly. And my answer is, when you're on premise, containerd, 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 containerd. If you need to choose, then choose containerd. And if you can't choose, then choose containerd. And only if you really can't choose, then go with whatever vendor you chose, be that Cryo, be that, Kata, be that whatever. Things like Kata, gvisor do work, but only use them if you absolutely have to. Because they add huge overhead and they're just another level of complexity, and something that a tiny little thing doesn't work in them because they didn't check this one edge case. Everything is tested on containerd because it's the de facto standard. Back to the standard statement of be with a standard.
Let's see whether we can have a fight or we're going to agree. From Cube, SOPs or sealed secrets? And you're not allowed to say neither. Use ASO, not an option.
I have to use one of them, is what you're saying.
Yeah, kind of. Because if that's not the requirement, I would say neither. Use ESO.
Exactly. So I was going to say that as well. If I had to use one of them, then the answer would be SOPs, and I really wish that wasn't the case. But the reason, because I prefer the mentality of sealed secrets more than that of SOPs, because SOPs doesn't have an official Kubernetes operator and controller. Yes. There is a good community one, but again, it's not official, so you never know. The reason I'm against sealed secrets, one reason, which is how difficult it is to encrypt and then deploy the same secret to multiple clusters. You basically get tied to a cluster unless you manually copy the encryption keys from one cluster to another and do that in some sync process. So sealed secrets being CRDs in one cluster is great, but no company ever ends with one cluster. You always end up having like a dev in production, or you end up having multiple. At that point, sealed secrets fails, and it's a major challenge with GitOps to throw sealed secrets into there, and then it fails. And what do you do when you have to restore a cluster? I need to restore a cluster because it went down and doesn't work. Sorry. Have a nice day.
I agree on that 100%. And yet I'm still going to say sealed secrets, even though you're right in everything you said. But this is my kind of, I'm going to vote for sealed secrets all the way until they create a decent operator, just because I think it's unacceptable. And it's not that hard.
I completely get that. I will say that the benefit of SOPs is that SOPs does integrate into Flux very well. It integrates into Cap Controller very well, and it integrates into Argo CD.
Oh yeah, if you like Lua, yeah.
Exactly. Like, it's possible though, which is why I'm saying, like, you don't technically need the operator when you're working with that. Again, pros and cons to all approaches, but yeah.
Okay, from Troubadour, none. I'm a DS student with an Ubuntu and 2 RTX GPUs, help setting up a dev and for research with Jupyter notebooks. I don't work with Jupyter, so I have no idea. Maybe Scott does. Delivering web or mobile apps. Can you recommend the order of videos from DOT? Order of videos from DOT. Honestly, I don't even know which videos I published more than a month ago. I have no idea.
The only one that I would say that I would recommend in this area, because really this channel isn't as much about this type of stuff, but the one that is interesting is running AI within Kubernetes. The Victor did that could be kind of relevant here of how to run an LLM locally, how GPUs work within Kubernetes, because you may want to look at breaking up your Kubernetes, and you can run Jupyter Hub as a Helm chart in Kubernetes and then get dynamic environments and look at how to share GPUs and break apart your 2 RTX GPUs into multiple micro GPUs. If you want to get started outside of Kubernetes, Docker Compose, or very simple, deploy Jupyter Hub and have a nice day. That's how I would start, though, bringing Kubernetes later on, unless your target is Kubernetes, and then, I would say look at that video.
I think that the important part here is, doesn't matter whether we're talking about Jupyter Notebooks, AI, or something else, learn Kubernetes, learn containers, learn Kubernetes. Yeah. Everything else just kind of builds on top of it and becomes easy. Okay, what boxes must a personal project tick to actually be presented as a great resource of learning, provided the time I meet software engineer? I don't know. What I can say, I don't know whether this is answering your question in any form of way. For me, and this is personal, biggest percentage of projects that I'd say this is horrible is because of the docs. Bad docs, bad project. Kind of like, it doesn't matter what it does.
Exactly. And good docs in terms of good for the new user. When you write docs, because I've synded this in the past, and I know many projects that have synded this that have more documentation than Wikipedia. However, you can't understand a word of it because it's all deep technical lingo. When you write it, you have to think, how do I make sure that someone who has never seen this tool, if you're writing a YAML templating tool, okay, let's say, right, a new YAML configuration language. If you start getting into the differences of every element of a YAML fragment and how it works and all that, that's great for a doctorate. That is not for documentation on how to use your tool, right? You need to think about how to use the tool, not the technical documentation of the implementation. Many people think that. So it's not just having docs and lots of docs, but it's having docs of how to use the tool with real examples, real world examples. Stop with the cat 1, 2, 3, apples, bananas, oranges. Give something that actually makes sense so that someone can wrap their head around it. Would be my recommendation in that area.
I have a very strong opinion about the docs that I think that, and this is me, I'm extrapolating to other people. I think that people have different, when they start with a project, they have different phases when they're making decision to continue or abort. And the first phase lasts 15 minutes. And if you say yes, you get an hour. And if you say yes after an hour, you get a day, and then exponentially more. Meaning that you need to convince me in 15 minutes that actually I'm going to spend 1 hour after that. And then you need to convince me in that hour that I'm going to spend a day, and after that, kind of eternity. Doesn't matter what it is.
The one other thing that makes... sorry.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like projects that takes hours to just understand what the heck, why am I actually here, are projects that I give up very, very quickly.
Yeah. I would say the one last thing on this note would be a good project should not make me go and I know that Victor is going to try and use this against me in 3 seconds, but I'm going to say it anyways, not relevant to one specific project. If there is an they should be delivering you the artifact and not telling me to do go run, not running npm run. There should be if you are doing a project, give me the binary, give me the container, give me the Helm chart, give me whatever it is to install. Do not just give me the source code and say, go run.
That's a red flag for me, kind of immediately. I'm not installing Python just to see whether I'm interested in that thing. No.
Correct. There's one exception to this. But
which one?
Backstage. But that's all.
No, that's why I gave up on Backstage 20 times before I actually finally was convinced to give it a serious try.
It's because people make the mistake of thinking that Backstage is a tool, or it is a component. No, it's a library. Backstage is a very, very advanced library that you should use to build your own internal developer portal. And if you consider it as a library and not as a product and not as a component of your system, but it is a library that you utilize, then it's fine.
I agree, but still, if I would be in charge of Backstage, right, I would still have a documentation that would start, have some quick start and say, hey, create cluster, Helm install. We know that you cannot run seriously Backstage with that chart, but kind of like,
right.
It would enable me to.
The docs, they fail that part. Yes.
Say again?
They fail the docs part. I was going to say the only thing that isn't relevant there is the, give me the container image, because for them, the actual output is source code, right, of their product. Yeah. So that's fine. But I agree.
Okay, from Nifan or something like that. From a Crossplane composition, why is it recommended to not have a deterministic composite name? And then there is more. It is not clear from the docs to me, but using Flux and Crossplane generates a new composite for every reconciliation, which generates unnecessary churn. I'm not sure I understand that.
So if I remember correctly, actually this second one that was just raised about Flux is there was a bug in one of the versions of Flux that was causing issues with specific fields and and it was basically overriding the ref name or resource ref within the composite. And because it was getting rid of that, so there's challenges on server-side apply versus client-side apply and removing of different fields. There are ways of solving that. It's just sometimes in the GitOps world and server-side apply, things get unique. But that's easy to solve, I would say. In terms of the other one, I didn't understand. Oh, the non-deterministic names. Whenever any resource is generated by a controller in Kubernetes, it gets a non-deterministic name because it always adds some unique ID at the end. That's the way that it works for replica sets from deployments and pods from replica sets. And it's nothing new. That's the Kubernetes paradigm. And that's just what Crossplane has followed as well.
I mean, otherwise kind of like you would have potential issues. Let's say that you have two claims with the same name in different namespaces.
Exactly. The second that it's cluster wide, you have a challenge in that area. So
exactly. Okay. Last one. Before we go through this, maybe one more. I'll collect all the questions that we haven't answered and put them for the next session. So, and there's a lot. So, Tiago, how would you automate using GitOps a database restore like RDS? It needs to be done in steps. Launch a new RDS, switch the app, and delete the old, which is not compatible to state and GitOps. This is one of the things I really like, for example, with CMPG, which I know it's not answering because the question is about RDS, is that when you define CMPG, Cloud Native Postgres, it knows that if you specified if you put in a spec that you want backup, it knows that when you create a new instance, what should do first, kind of like create a volume, restore the backup, then put the rest, and so on and so forth. And for the app, I think that apps, so let's say that you deploy both the app and the database. An app tries to connect to the database is not running, and the app cannot connect to it. And everybody sees that as a problem. I don't. Just kind of fail. Kind of like, yeah, you cannot connect to the database. Go down. Kubernetes will start the pod again, and again, and again, and eventually database will be running and it will say, great, happy, I can do it. It's not a problem if it fails.
Yeah. The one thing I would say about all of this is that I think that people convolute the idea of GitOps and thinking that that means CD, and it isn't. It is a part of CD. It is how we do actual deployment, and you still need CD pipelines. That could be in the future, maybe Cargo, for those that have bought into the Argo world and want to utilize that, although I have my differing opinions than Cargo. But it could be GitHub Actions, it could be Jenkins, it could be Tecton Argo workflow, doesn't matter. You need some pipeline that manages continuous delivery. And this is something I don't believe that we should be making GitOps do these things. We should be having if you have a pipeline that does this, you trigger that pipeline that is going to commit to the repo, the new database instance. It is going to wait for the reconciliation to happen, and then you are going to run the restore and this, and you will have an imperative process that when that's done, though, everything is consistently reconciled. So basically, the only difference is it's a git push instead of kubectl apply. Nothing else is supposed to change in how you do CD. The whole difference is instead of kubectl apply, do git push, in my mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm very, very disappointed that everybody calls Argo CD and Flux CD. I'm very disappointed that Flux CD website URL is fluxcd.io, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
They're not CD tools. Continuous delivery is a process. And pushing stuff to Git is, and then reconciling is only a fraction of it. And you said Cargo might change that? No. Cargo is in charge of promotions. You will still need to somehow trigger those promotions through workflows, and you will probably do some other operations after you do promotions. So, no.
Exactly. Right. But there's going to be a tool in this area. Like, there's no question that one of these vendors is going to come out with a tool here. The truth of the matter is Argo technically already does with Argo workflows, right? They have a tool that works for this, right? They have a workflow engine. You have Tecton, you have GitHub Actions. Choose poison. But it's just a CI tool.
The way I like to explain it is that there is a state management on one hand, and there are one-shot actions on the other. Workflows are unavoidable for one-shot actions. You need to build some images. You need to run some tests. You need to lint some things. You need to do a bunch of things.
You need to restore a database, as is brought up here, right? That is a one-time action. You're not continuously restoring a database. I hope not.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can consider. So yeah, I mean, speaking of databases, kind of, you can consider scheme as a state.
For sure, schema hero,
and then
or
data. That's not the
Atlas.
State. Or right. I mean, data is a state, but it's not a state that you manage in that way. Kind of, absolutely no.
Yeah.
Okay, this was wonderful. We need to stop here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for an overwhelming number of questions. I'm going to collect those and put them in the next episode, probably next week. And Scott, if he enjoyed it, maybe he will join us as a
always
backup.
A pleasure being with you.
There we go. We're gonna make him unpaid regular. No, Scott, I can share 50% of the profits if you want to join.
50% of community effort is the community is
no. There are ads in this stream. Maybe there will be half a dollar in total. So
give it to charity. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.